Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. Man comes with Dr. Troy. He feels my forehead, rolls up my eyelids, turns me over to see my back, picks me up and runs to his motor car. Ma'am runs after him and he tells her I have typhoid fever. Ma'am cries. Am I to lose the whole family? Will it ever end? She gets into the car, holds me in her lap, and moans all the way to the fever hospital at the city home. The bed has cool white sheets. The nurses have clean white uniforms, and the nun, Sister Rita, is all in white. Dr. Humphrey and Dr. Campbell have white coats and things hanging from their necks which they stick against my chest and all over. I sleep and sleep, but I'm awake when they bring in jars of bright red stuff that hang from tall poles above my bed, and they stick tubes into my ankles and the back of my right hand. Sister Rita says you're getting blood, Francis. Soldier's blood from the Sarsfield barracks. Ma'am is sitting by the bed, and the nurse is saying, "You know, missus, this is very unusual. No one is ever allowed into Fever Hospital for fear they'd catch something, but they made an exception for you with his crisis coming. If he gets over this, he'll surely recover." I fall asleep. Ma'am is gone when I wake up, but there's movement in the room, and it's the priest, Father Gorey, from the confraternity, saying mass at a table in the corner. I drift off again, and now they're waking me and pulling down the bedclothes. Father Gorey is touching me with oil and praying in Latin. I know it's extreme unction, and that means I'm going to die, and I don't care. They wake me again to receive communion. I don't want it. I'm afraid I might get sick. I keep the wafer on my tongue and fall asleep, and when I wake up again, it's gone. It's dark, and Dr. Campbell is sitting by my bed. He's holding my wrist and looking at his watch. He has red hair and glasses, and he always smiles when he talks to me. He sits now and hums and looks out the window. His eyes close, and he snores a little. Sister Rita's white habit is bright in the sun that comes in the window. She's holding my wrist, looking at her watch, smiling. "Oh," she says, "we're awake, are we? Well, Francis, I think we've come through the worst. Our prayers are answered, and all the prayers of those hundreds of little boys of the confraternity. Can you imagine that? Hundreds of boys saying the rosary for you and offering up their communion. My ankles and the back of my hand are throbbing from the tubes bringing in the blood, and I don't care about boys praying for me. I can hear the swish of Sister Rita's habit and the click of her rosary beads when she leaves the room. I fall asleep, and when it's dark and Dad is sitting by the bed with his hand on mine. "Son, are you awake?" I try to talk, but I'm dry. Nothing will come out, and I point to my mouth. He holds a glass of water to my lips, and it's sweet and cool. He presses my hand and says I'm a great old soldier. And why wouldn't I? Don't I have a soldier's blood in me? The tubes are not in me anymore, and the glass jars are gone. Sister Rita comes in and tells Daddy he has to go. I don't want him to go because he looks sad. When he looks sad, it's the worst thing in the world, and I start crying. "Now what's this?" says Sister Rita. "Crying with all that soldier blood in you? There's a big surprise for you tomorrow, Francis. You'll never guess." "Well, I'll tell you. We're bringing you a new biscuit with your tea in the morning. Isn't that a treat? And your father will be back in a day or two, won't you, Mr. McCourt?" Dad nods and puts his hand on mine again. He looks at me, steps away, stops, comes back, kisses me on the forehead for the first time in my life, and I'm so happy I feel like floating out of the bed. The other two beds in my room are empty. The nurse says I'm the only typhoid patient, and I'm a miracle for getting over the crisis. The room next to me is empty till one morning a girl's voice says, "Yoo-hoo, who's there?" And I'm not sure if she's talking to me or someone in the room beyond. "Yoo-hoo, boy with the typhoid, are you awake?" I am. "Are you better?" I am. "Well, why are you here?" "I don't know. I'm still in the bed. They stick needles in me and give me medicine." "What do you look like?" I wonder what kind of question is that. I don't know what to tell her. "Yoo-hoo, are you there, typhoid boy?" I am. "What's your name?" "Frank." "That's a good name. My name is Patricia Madigan. How old are you?" "10." "Oh," she sounds disappointed. "But I'll be 11 in August next month." "Well, that's better than 10. I'll be 14 in September. Do you want to know why I'm in the fever hospital?" I do. "I have diphtheria and something else." "What's something else?" "They don't know. They think I have a disease from foreign parts because my father used to be in Africa. I nearly died. Are you going to tell me what you look like?" "I have black hair." "You in millions." "I have brown eyes with bits of green. That's called hazel." "You in thousands." "I have stitches on the back of my right hand and my 2 feet where they put in the soldier's blood." "Oh, did they?" "They did." "You won't be able to start marching and saluting." There's a swish of habit and a click of beads, and then Sister Rita's voice. Now, what's this? There's to be no talking between two rooms, especially when it's a boy and a girl. Do you hear me, Patricia? I do, sister. Do you hear me, Francis? I do, sister. You could be giving thanks for your two remarkable recoveries. You could be saying the rosary. You could be reading the little messenger of the Sacred Heart that's beside your bed. Don't let me come back and find you talking. She comes into my room and wags her finger at me. Especially you, Francis. After thousands of boys prayed for you at the confraternity. Give thanks, Francis, give thanks. She leaves in their silence for a while. Then Patricia whispers, Give thanks, Francis. Give thanks and say your rosary, Francis. And I laugh so hard a nurse runs in to see if I'm all right. She's a very stern nurse from the county Kerry, and she frightens me. What's this, Francis? Laughing? What is there to laugh about? Are you and that Madigan girl talking? I'll report you to Sister Rita. There's to be no laughing, for you could be doing serious damage to your internal apparatus. She plods out, and Patricia whispers again in a heavy Kerry accent. No laughing, Francis. You could be doing serious damage to your internal apparatus. Say your rosary, Francis, and pray for your internal apparatus. Mam visits me on Thursdays. I'd like to see my father, too, but I'm out of danger. Crisis time is over, and I'm allowed only one visitor. Besides, she says, he's back at work at Rank's flour mills, and please God this job will last a while, with the war on and the English desperate for flour. She brings me a chocolate bar, and that proves Dad is working. She could never afford it on the dole. He sends me notes. He tells me my brothers are all praying for me, that I should be a good boy, obey the doctors, the nuns, the nurses, and don't forget to say my prayers. He's sure St. Jude pulled me through the crisis, because he's the patron saint of desperate cases, and I was indeed a desperate case. Patricia says she has 2 books by her bed. One is a poetry book, and that's the one she loves. The other is a short history of England and Do I Want It. She gives it to Seamus, the man who mops the floors every day, and he brings it to me. He says I'm not supposed to be bringing anything from a diphtheria room to a typhoid room with all the germs flying around and hiding between the pages. And if you ever catch diphtheria on top of the typhoid, they'll know, and I'll lose my good job and be out in the street singing patriotic songs with a tin cup in my hand, which I could easily do because there isn't a song ever written about Ireland's sufferings I don't know. Oh, yes, he knows Roddy McCorley. He'll sing it for me right enough, but he's barely into the first verse when the Kerry nurse rushes in. What's this, Seamus? Singing? Of all the people in this hospital, you should know the rules against singing. I have a good mind to report you to Sister Rita. Ah, don't do that, nurse. Very well, Seamus. I'll let it go this one time. You know the singing could lead to a relapse in these patients. When she leaves, he whispers he'll teach me a few songs because singing is good for passing the time when you're by yourself in a typhoid room. He says Patricia's a lovely girl the way she often gives him sweets from the parcel her mother sends every fortnight. He stops mopping the floor and calls to Patricia in the next room. I was telling Frankie you're a lovely girl, Patricia, and she says, You're a lovely man, Seamus. He smiles because he's an old man of 40 and he never had children but the ones he can talk to here in the fever hospital. He says, Here's the book, Frankie. Isn't it a great pity you have to be reading all about England after all they did to us, and there isn't a history of Ireland to be had in this hospital? The book tells me all about King Alfred and William the Conqueror and all the kings and queens down to Edward, who had to wait forever for his mother Victoria to die before he could be king. The book has the first bit of Shakespeare I ever read. I do believe, induced by potent circumstance, that thou art mine enemy. The history writer says this is what Catherine, who is a wife of Henry VIII, says to Cardinal Wolsey, who is trying to have her head cut off. I don't know what it means, and I don't care because it's Shakespeare, and it's like having jewels in my mouth when I say the words. If I had a whole book of Shakespeare, they could keep me in the hospital for a year. Patricia says she doesn't know what induced means or potent circumstances, and she doesn't care about Shakespeare. She has her poetry book, and she reads to me from beyond the wall a poem about an owl and a pussycat that went to sea in a green boat with honey and money, and it makes no sense. And when I say that, Patricia gets huffy and says the last poem she'll ever read to me. She says I'm always reciting the lines from Shakespeare, and they make no sense either. Seamus stops mopping again and tells us we shouldn't be fighting over poetry because we'll have enough to fight about when we grow up and get married. Patricia says she's sorry, and I'm sorry too, so she reads me part of another poem, which I have to remember so I can say it back to her early in the morning or late at night when there are no nuns or nurses about. The wind was a torrent of darkness among the gusty trees. The moon was a ghostly galleon tossed upon cloudy seas. The road was a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor, and the highwayman came riding, riding, riding. The highwayman came riding up to the old inn door. He had a French cocked hat on his forehead, a bunch of lace at his chin, a coat of the claret velvet, and breeches of brown doe skin. They fitted with never a wrinkle, his boots were up to the thigh, and he rode with a jewelled twinkle, his pistol butts a twinkle, his rapier hilt a twinkle, under the jewelled sky. Every day I can't wait for the doctors and nurses to leave me alone so I can learn a new verse from Patricia and find out what's happening to the highwayman and the landlord's red-lipped daughter. I love the poem because it's exciting and almost as good as my 2 lines of Shakespeare. The red coats are after the highwayman because they know he told her, "I'll come to thee by moonlight." I'd love to do that myself. Come by moonlight for Patricia in the next room. She's ready to read the last few verses when in comes the nurse from Carrie shouting at her, shouting at me. "I told ye there was to be no talking between rooms. Diphtheria is never allowed to talk to typhoid and vice versa. I warned ye." And she calls out, "Seamus, take this one. Take the bee. Sister Rita said one more word out of him and upstairs with him. We gave you a warning to stop the blathering, but ye wouldn't. Take the bee, Seamus, take him." And now, nurse, sure isn't he harmless? It's only a bit of poetry. "Take that beast, Seamus, take him at once." He stands over me and whispers, "I'm sorry, Francis. Here's your English history book." He slips the book under my shirt and lifts me from the bed. He whispers that I'm a feather. I try to see Patricia when we pass through her room, but all I can make out is a blur of dark head on a pillow. Sister Rita stops us in the hall to tell me I'm a great disappointment to her, that she expected me to be a good boy after what God had done for me, after all the prayers said by hundreds of boys at the confraternity, after all the care from the nuns and the nurses of the fever hospital, after the way they let my mother and father in to see me, a thing rarely allowed. And this is how I repaid them, lying in the bed reciting silly poetry back and forth with Patricia Madigan, knowing very well there was a ban on all talk between typhoid and diphtheria. She says I'll have plenty of time to reflect on my sins in the big ward upstairs, and I should beg forgiveness for my disobedience, reciting a pagan English poem about a thief on a horse and a maiden with red lips, who commits a terrible sin when I could have been praying or reading the life of a saint. She made it her business to read that poem, so she did, and I'd be well advised to tell the priest in confession. The Carrie nurse follows us upstairs, gasping and holding on to the banister. She tells me I better not get the notion she'll be running up to this part of the world every time I have a little pain or a twinge. There are 20 empty beds in the ward, all white, all empty. The nurse tells Seamus put me at the far end of the ward against the wall to make sure I don't talk to anyone who might be passing the door, which is very unlikely since there isn't another soul on this whole floor. She tells Seamus this was the fever ward during the Great Famine long ago, and only God knows how many died here, brought in too late for anything but a wash before they were buried, and there are stories of cries and moans in the far reaches of the night. She says 'twould break your heart to think of what the English did to us, that if they didn't put the blight on the potato, they didn't do much to take it off. No pity. No feeling at all for the people that died in this very ward, children suffering and dying here while the English feasted on roast beef and guzzled the best of the wine in their big houses, little children with their mouths all green from trying to eat the grass in the fields beyond. God bless us and save us and guard us from future famines. Seamus says 'twas a terrible thing indeed, and he wouldn't want to be walking these halls in the dark with all the little green mouths gaping at him. The nurse takes my temperature. 'Tis up a bit. Have a good sleep for yourself now that you're away from the chatter with Patricia Madigan below, who will never know a grey hair. She shakes her head at Seamus, and he gives her a sad shake back. Nurses and nuns never think you know what they're talking about. If you're 10 going on 11, you're supposed to be simple, like my Uncle Pat Sheehan, who was dropped on his head. You can't ask questions. You can't show you understand what the nurse said about Patricia Madigan, that she's going to die. And you can't show you want to cry over this girl who taught you a lovely poem, which the nun says is bad. The nurse tells Seamus she has to go, and he's to sweep the lint from under my bed and mop up a bit around the ward. Seamus tells me that you can't catch a disease from. He never heard the likes of it. A little fella shifted upstairs for saying a poem, and he has a good mind to go to the Limerick Leader and tell them print the whole thing, except he has this job and he'd lose it if ever Sister Rita found out. Anyway, Frankie, you'll be out of here one of these fine days, and you can read all the poetry you want, though I don't know about Patricia below. I don't know about Patricia. He knows about Patricia in 2 days because she got out of the bed to go to the lavatory when she was supposed to use a bedpan and collapsed and died in the lavatory. Seamus is mopping the floor, and there are tears on his cheeks, and he's saying, "'Tis a dirty, rotten thing to die in a lavatory when you're lovely in yourself. She told me she was sorry she had you reciting that poem and getting you shifted from the room, Frankie. She said 'twas all her fault. It wasn't, Seamus. I know, and didn't I tell her that? Patricia's gone, and I'll never know what happened to the highwayman and Bess, the landlord's daughter. I asked Seamus, but he doesn't know any poetry at all, especially English poetry. He knew an Irish poem once, but it was about fairies and had no sign of a highwayman in it. Still, he'll ask the men in his local pub, when there's always someone reciting something, and he'll bring it back to me. Won't I be busy meanwhile reading my short history of England and finding out all about their perfidy? That's what Seamus says, perfidy. And I don't know what it means, and he doesn't know what it means, but if it's something the English do, it must be terrible. He comes 3 times a week to mop the floor, and the nurse is there every morning to take my temperature and pulse. The doctor listens to my chest and with the thing hanging from his neck. They all say, "And how's our little soldier today?" A girl with a blue dress brings meals 3 times a day and never talks to me. Seamus says she's not right in the head, so don't say a word to her. The July days are long, and I fear the dark. There are only 2 ceiling lights in the ward, and they're switched off when the tea tray is taken away and the nurse gives me pills. The nurse tells me to go to sleep, but I can't because I see people in the 19 beds in the ward all dying and green around their mouths where they tried to eat grass and moaning for soup, Protestant soup, any soup. And I cover my face with the pillow hoping they won't come, and stand around the bed clawing at me and howling for bits of the chocolate bar my mother brought last week. No, she didn't bring it. She had to send it in because I can't have any more visitors. Sister Rita tells me a visit to the fever hospital is a privilege, and after my bad behavior with Patricia Madigan and that poem, I can't have the privilege anymore. She says I'll be going home in a few weeks, and my job is to concentrate on getting better and learn to walk again after being in bed for 6 weeks, and I can get out of bed tomorrow after breakfast. I don't know why she says I have to learn how to walk when I've been walking since I was a baby, but when the nurse stands me by the side of the bed, I fall to the floor and the nurse laughs. See, you're a baby again. I practice walking from bed to bed back and forth, back and forth. I don't want to be a baby. I don't want to be in this empty ward with no Patricia and no highwayman and no red-lipped landlord's daughter. I don't want the ghosts of children with green mouths pointing bony fingers at me and clamoring for bits of my chocolate bar. Seamus says a man in his pub knew all the verses of the highwayman poem, and it has a very sad end. Would I like him to say it? Because he never learned how to read, and he had to carry the poem in his head. He stops in the middle of the ward, leaning on his mop, and recites, "Tlot, tlot, in the frosty silence, tlot, tlot, in the echoing night. Nearer he came and nearer, her face was like a light. Her eyes grew wide for a moment, she drew one last deep breath. Then her finger moved in the moonlight. Her musket shattered in the moonlight, shattered her breath in the moonlight, and warned him with her death. He hears the shot and escapes, but when he learns at dawn how Bess died, he goes into a rage and returns for revenge only to be shot down by the redcoats. Blood white were his spurs in the golden noon, wine red was his velvet coat, when they shot him down on the highway, down like a dog on the highway, and he lay in his blood on the highway with a bunch of lace at his throat." Seamus wipes his sleeve across his face and sniffles. He says there was no call at all to shift you up here away from Patricia when you didn't even know what happened to the highwayman and Bess. 'Tis a very sad story, and when I said it to my wife she wouldn't stop crying the whole night till we went to bed. She said there was no call for them redcoats to shoot that highwayman. They are responsible for half the troubles of the world, and they never had any pity on the Irish either. Now if you want to know any more poems, Frankie, tell me, and I'll get them from the pub and bring them back in my head.